How did you respond when you found out what your mom's boyfriend's tutoring sessions were really about? I found the first journal entry on a Wednesday in November when I was looking for printer paper in David's home office. The filing cabinet drawer stuck when I pulled it, and a spiral notebook fell forward into my hands. It was open to a page dated 3 weeks earlier with a girl's name at the top. Melissa, age 14, session notes. Below that were detailed observations about her body, what she wore, how she responded to his touch during tutoring. My hands went numb holding it. David had been Mom's boyfriend for 18 months and lived with us for the past 6. He tutored high school students in math and science 3 evenings a week in our dining room. I was 17 and heard him working with students constantly through my bedroom wall. The sessions always sounded normal. Kids asking questions, David explaining concepts, occasional laughter when someone finally understood a difficult problem. I'd met some of his students when I passed through to get snacks. They seemed comfortable with him. The notebook contained entries for 6 different girls spanning 4 months. Each entry followed the same format: name, age, date, and detailed notes about physical appearance, clothing choices, and David's observations about their personalities and vulnerabilities. One entry described a girl named Sophie who'd mentioned her parents were divorcing. David wrote that emotional vulnerability created opportunities for building trust and dependence. Another entry about a girl named Autumn noted she wore tank tops to sessions, and David had started positioning himself behind her while reviewing her work so he could look down her shirt. My stomach turned over as I read page after page of predatory planning disguised as teaching notes. David documented which girls seemed isolated at school, which ones craved adult attention, which ones he thought he could manipulate most easily. This wasn't tutoring. This was hunting. I heard the front door open downstairs. David called out that he was home early. I shoved the notebook back in the drawer and closed the filing cabinet as quietly as possible. My heart hammered against my ribs as I grabbed printer paper from the shelf and walked out of his office trying to look casual. David stood in the kitchen unpacking groceries. He smiled when he saw me and asked if I'd finished my college essay. I said almost, and held up the paper as explanation for being upstairs. He nodded and went back to putting away food. I went to my room and sat on my bed trying to process what I'd just read. David had access to teenage girls in our home multiple times per week. He'd been documenting his inappropriate interest in them for months. Mom trusted him completely. She thought his tutoring was generous community service. She had no idea he was using it to get close to vulnerable teenagers. That evening, David tutored 2 students. I stayed in my room with my door cracked open and listened more carefully than ever before. First was a junior named Caitlin working on chemistry. Their session sounded normal at first. David explained molecular bonding, and Caitlin asked clarifying questions. Then I heard David say Caitlin seemed tense and offered to show her a shoulder massage technique that helped with stress. My skin crawled. Caitlin laughed nervously and said she was fine. David insisted, saying tension affected concentration, and he wanted her to succeed. There was a long pause. Then Caitlin said, "Okay," in a quiet voice. I heard David moving around and then telling Caitlin to relax her shoulders. He talked her through the massage for several minutes while supposedly explaining how muscle tension related to the nervous system. Caitlin stayed quiet. When the session ended 30 minutes later, I heard her leave quickly without the usual chatting. The second student was a sophomore named Isabel. I recognized her voice from previous sessions. She struggled with algebra, and David had been tutoring her for 3 months. Mom praised David constantly for his patience with Isabel, saying she'd gone from failing to passing because of his help. Tonight, their session included David asking Isabel personal questions between math problems. Did she have a boyfriend? Was she happy at school? Did she feel like her parents understood her? Isabel answered hesitantly. She mentioned feeling lonely sometimes and not fitting in with other kids her age. David's voice took on a sympathetic tone. He said he understood feeling different, and that sometimes the smartest people felt isolated because others couldn't relate to them. He told Isabel she was special and mature for her age. He said he enjoyed their sessions because she wasn't like other students. She was more interesting. The manipulation was textbook grooming. I'd learned about it in health class last year. After Isabel left, I waited until David went to shower before going back to his office. I needed more evidence. The filing cabinet had 3 drawers. The top one contained the notebook I'd found earlier. The middle drawer held file folders labeled with girls' names. Each folder contained printed tutoring schedules, academic assessments, and notes David had taken during sessions. But mixed in were photos. Pictures David had clearly taken without the girls knowing. Isabel doing homework, with her head bent over her notebook. Caitlin reaching for a book on a high shelf. Melissa stretching with her arms over her head. Every photo was angled to capture the girls' bodies in ways that had nothing to do with academics. The bottom drawer held David's laptop, charging cable, and external hard drives. I didn't have time to check the drives before I heard the shower turn off upstairs. I closed everything and got out of the office. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about those girls sitting at our dining room table with David while he documented their vulnerabilities and took photos without their knowledge. I thought about how David had moved into our house specifically to have private access to students. Mom worked evening shifts as a nurse 3 days a week, which meant David was often alone in the house during tutoring sessions. I was usually in my room doing homework. He'd created the perfect setup. The next morning after Mom left for her day shift and David went to his job at the community college where he taught part-time, I called my older sister, Rachel. She lived across town with her husband, Kevin. I told her I needed to talk about something serious involving David. Rachel said to come over immediately. She'd always been suspicious of David. She thought he was too interested in being helpful and too eager to insert himself into Mom's life. I drove to Rachel's apartment and showed her photos I'd taken of the notebook entries on my phone. Rachel's expression hardened as she read David's notes about manipulating emotionally vulnerable teenagers. I told her about the folders with photos and the external hard drives I hadn't been able to access. Rachel said we needed to tell Mom immediately and contact the police. I was afraid Mom wouldn't believe us. She was deeply in love with David. He'd been attentive and supportive after her difficult divorce from our dad 3 years ago. She talked constantly about how lucky she was to find someone so caring and community-minded. Rachel said Mom's feelings didn't matter more than protecting those girls. We called Mom and told her to come to Rachel's apartment as soon as her shift ended. Mom arrived, confused and worried. She asked what was wrong. I showed her the photos of David's notebook entries. Mom's face went pale as she read his observations about teenage girls' bodies and his strategies for building inappropriate relationships. Mom's hands started shaking. She read the entries twice and then asked if I was sure these were David's. I told her about finding the notebook in his filing cabinet, the folders with photos, and what I'd overheard during tutoring sessions. I described David offering to massage Caitlin and asking Isabel personal questions designed to make her feel special and isolated. Mom sat down hard on Rachel's couch. She said David had told her his tutoring focused on building students' confidence alongside academic skills. She thought his personal approach was what made him effective. She'd never suspected anything inappropriate. Rachel said we needed to call the police right now. Mom nodded slowly. Her whole world had just collapsed. She pulled out her phone and dialed. The operator transferred her to a detective named Luis Moreno, who handled cases involving minors. Detective Moreno said he'd meet us at the police station in an hour. Detective Moreno was in his 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened carefully as I described finding the notebook and showed him the photos I'd taken. Mom explained David's tutoring setup and how he'd been working with high school students in our home for over a year. Detective Moreno asked detailed questions about the tutoring schedule, how many students David worked with, and whether we knew if he tutored anyone else outside our house. Mom said David mentioned occasionally tutoring students at the community college, but she didn't know specifics. Detective Moreno said the notebook entries and photos suggested predatory behavior and grooming. He needed to move fast before David realized anyone was investigating. He asked for our help accessing David's office and the external hard drives. We agreed to cooperate fully. Detective Moreno said he'd need to interview the girls named in the notebook to assess whether any abuse had occurred. Detective Moreno contacted the school district to get contact information for the students David tutored. He reached out to their parents and explained that David was under investigation for inappropriate conduct. Several parents immediately said they'd noticed concerning behavior, but hadn't reported it because they thought they were overreacting. One mother said David always found excuses to touch her daughter during tutoring, adjusting her posture, or guiding her hands while she wrote equations. The mother had felt uncomfortable, but David explained he was using kinesthetic teaching methods proven to help students learn. Another father said his daughter had mentioned David asking her personal questions and making comments about her appearance. The father had told David to keep things professional, but David said building rapport was essential to effective tutoring. The parents had been manipulated just as effectively as the students. David used educational jargon and positioned himself as an expert to deflect concerns. The investigation moved quickly. Detective Moreno obtained a search warrant for our house. He coordinated the execution for Friday morning when David would be teaching at the community college and Mom would be at work. I stayed home from school to let the officers inside. They arrived at 9 in the morning with Detective Moreno and a forensic computer specialist named Angela Park. I showed them to David's office. They seized his laptop, the external hard drives, the filing cabinet with all the folders and notebooks, and his personal cell phone that he'd left charging on his desk. Angela began examining the hard drives immediately using portable equipment. Within 30 minutes, she found encrypted folders containing hundreds of photos of teenage girls. Most were taken during tutoring sessions. Girls bending over textbooks, reaching for materials, sitting in ways that exposed their bodies. None of the girls appeared aware they were being photographed. Angela also found hidden camera footage. David had installed a small camera in our dining room, positioned to record tutoring sessions from an angle that captured the girls, but not David himself. The footage was damning. Hours of recordings showed David deliberately creating situations that allowed him to touch students inappropriately. He'd move behind girls to look over their shoulders and press his body against them. He'd reach across them to point at something in their textbooks and let his arm brush against their chests. He'd adjust their posture by putting his hands on their shoulders, backs, and sometimes their legs. The girls mostly looked uncomfortable but didn't object. David was an adult authority figure in a teaching role. They'd been conditioned to accept his touch as part of the learning process. Several recordings showed David asking personal questions designed to isolate the girls emotionally. He'd tell them they were different from other students, more mature, more intelligent. He'd create an us versus them dynamic that made the girls feel special while also making them dependent on his validation. The grooming was systematic and calculated. Angela said they had enough evidence to arrest David immediately. Detective Moreno called the community college and confirmed David was currently teaching a class. He arranged for campus security to detain David and bring him to the station for questioning. Officers met David as he left his classroom. He was confused but cooperative, apparently thinking there'd been some administrative mistake. They transported him to the police station and placed him in an interrogation room. Detective Moreno let him sit there for 2 hours while the forensic team finished processing evidence from our house. When Moreno finally entered the room, he laid out printed screenshots of David's notebook entries and photos from the hard drives. David's face drained of color. Moreno asked him to explain the materials. David tried claiming they were teaching documentation and that photographing students helped him remember their learning styles. Moreno asked why teaching documentation included observations about girls' bodies and what they wore. David said those details helped him understand how students presented themselves and their confidence levels. Moreno played clips from the hidden camera footage showing David touching students inappropriately and asking personal questions. David watched the videos and then said he wanted a lawyer. The interview ended. David was arrested and charged with multiple felonies including sexual exploitation of a minor, unlawful surveillance, and child endangerment. The charges covered his documentation of minors in sexual contexts, hidden camera recordings without consent, and grooming behavior. Bail was set at $200,000. David couldn't afford it and remained in jail. Mom was destroyed. She blamed herself for not seeing the warning signs and for allowing David into our home where he had access to vulnerable teenagers. Rachel and I told her repeatedly that David was a skilled manipulator who'd fooled everyone. The parents hadn't recognized the signs. The school hadn't flagged concerns. David had been careful and deliberate in building trust while hiding his predatory behavior. Mom filed for a restraining order and began the process of removing David from our house completely. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detective Moreno contacted the community college where David taught and discovered he'd been tutoring students there as well. College administrators gave police access to David's office. They found similar documentation for several college students, mostly young women between 18 and 20. David had used the same grooming tactics with them. He'd identified vulnerable students struggling academically or socially and offered free tutoring. He documented their personal information and photographed them without consent. Several college students came forward after learning about the investigation and said David had made them uncomfortable with personal questions and unwanted touching. One woman said David had offered her a massage during a tutoring session and became aggressive when she refused. She'd reported the incident to her department chair, who'd told David to be more professional. No formal action was taken. Another student said David had tried to develop a romantic relationship with her after she turned 19, buying her gifts and sending inappropriate messages. She'd stopped attending his tutoring sessions but hadn't reported him because she was embarrassed. The pattern extended back years. Detective Moreno tracked David's employment history and found he'd worked at 3 different schools and 2 other colleges before coming to our town. He reached out to administrators at those institutions. Each one had received complaints about David's behavior with students. At one high school, multiple parents had reported that David made their daughters uncomfortable during after-school tutoring. The principal had spoken with David, who'd promised to maintain better boundaries. At a previous college, a student had filed a formal complaint saying David had touched her inappropriately during office hours. The college had investigated and found insufficient evidence to terminate him, but had not renewed his contract. David had simply moved to another institution and continued the same behavior. The system had failed repeatedly. Instead of stopping David, administrators had passed him along to the next school, where he'd find new victims. The institutional negligence was staggering. Detective Moreno assembled evidence from all of David's previous locations. Combined with what they'd found in our house, the case against him was overwhelming. The district attorney's office assigned a senior prosecutor named Catherine Vale to handle the case. She met with Mom, Rachel, and me in early December. Catherine was in her 40s, with a reputation for aggressive prosecution of crimes against children. She explained that David would face state charges for his conduct with minors and potentially federal charges related to his digital collection of exploitative materials. The case would be complex because David had been careful not to commit obvious criminal acts during many of the tutoring sessions. His touching could be framed as accidental or pedagogical. His personal questions could be defended as building rapport. But the totality of evidence, the documentation, the hidden cameras, and the pattern across multiple institutions showed clear predatory intent. Catherine said she needed victims willing to testify. Several families agreed to participate in the prosecution. Melissa's parents were devastated when they learned what David had been documenting about their daughter. They'd thought he was helping her improve her math grades. Melissa confirmed that David had touched her inappropriately during sessions and made comments about her appearance that made her uncomfortable. She'd never told her parents because she thought she was misinterpreting his intentions. Isabel's mother cried when Detective Moreno showed her David's notes about her daughter being vulnerable and isolated. Isabel had been going through a difficult time at school, and David had positioned himself as her only supporter. He'd told Isabel he understood her better than anyone else, and that she could trust him with anything. Isabel admitted David had tried to hug her at the end of several sessions, and had kissed her forehead once. She'd felt confused and uncomfortable, but David told her he cared about her like family. Caitlin confirmed the unwanted massage and said David had touched her inappropriately on multiple occasions during tutoring. She'd stopped seeing him after the massage incident, but hadn't reported it because she felt embarrassed. The preliminary hearing happened in January. The courtroom was packed with parents and concerned community members. David appeared in court wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed. He looked smaller and older than I remembered. His lawyer, a public defender named Graham Ford, argued that the evidence showed poor judgment and boundary violations, but not criminal behavior. He claimed David's notebooks were teaching tools and the photos were innocent documentation. Catherine destroyed that argument systematically. She presented the hidden camera footage showing David deliberately touching students inappropriately. She showed the court David's detailed notes about manipulating emotionally vulnerable teenagers. She read excerpts from his communications with college students, where he'd made sexual comments and requests. She presented testimony from experts on grooming behavior who explained how David's actions fit the textbook pattern of an adult predator building relationships with minors for sexual purposes. The judge found probable cause for all charges and ordered David held without bail pending trial. He'd been deemed a danger to the community. The trial began in March. Catherine's case was methodical and devastating. She called 14 witnesses over 4 days. Each one described David's pattern of identifying vulnerable students, building inappropriate relationships, and touching them without consent under the guise of tutoring. Melissa testified about David commenting on her body and touching her shoulders and back during sessions. Isabel cried on the stand as she described David telling her she was special and different from other girls. Caitlin detailed the unwanted massage and other incidents where David had touched her inappropriately. College students testified about David's boundary violations and attempts to develop romantic or sexual relationships. Detective Moreno walked the jury through the evidence found in David's office: the notebooks documenting students' vulnerabilities, the photos taken without consent, the hidden camera footage, the encrypted folders containing hundreds of exploitative images. Catherine showed the jury David's pattern across multiple institutions and the complaints that had been ignored by administrators. I testified on the second day. Catherine asked me to explain how I discovered David's notebooks and what I'd found. I described reading his detailed observations about teenage girls' bodies and his strategies for manipulation. I explained overhearing tutoring sessions where he'd touched students inappropriately and asked invasive personal questions. Catherine showed the jury some of the photos I'd taken of David's notebook entries. The jury looked disgusted. Graham's cross-examination tried to suggest I'd invaded David's privacy and had ulterior motives for wanting to destroy his relationship with my mother. I said I'd been protecting the girls David was exploiting. Graham asked if I understood that tutoring required building personal connections with students. I said building connections didn't require touching them inappropriately or documenting their vulnerabilities for predatory purposes. Graham tried to rattle me for 30 minutes, but I kept returning to the facts. David had systematically groomed vulnerable teenagers. Nothing about that was educational or appropriate. Mom testified on the third day. She was pale, and her voice shook as she described how David had manipulated her trust to gain access to students. She explained that she'd believed David was providing valuable community service through tutoring. She'd never suspected his real motives. Catherine asked if Mom had noticed any warning signs. Mom said David had been charming and attentive, exactly what she'd needed after a difficult divorce. He'd positioned himself as supportive and community-minded. She'd seen what she wanted to see and missed what was really happening in her own home. Mom broke down on the stand apologizing to the victims and their families. The judge called a recess. When testimony resumed, Catherine called expert witnesses on grooming behavior and child sexual exploitation. Dr. Elizabeth Hunt, a psychologist specializing in predatory behavior, explained that David's actions represented a clear pattern of grooming with likely intent to escalate to physical sexual abuse. She said David's documentation and hidden cameras showed sophisticated planning and that without intervention, he would have continued targeting students. David's defense was weak. Graham tried arguing that David had boundary issues but no criminal intent. He called character witnesses who testified that David was passionate about teaching and helping struggling students. Catherine's cross-examination revealed that none of these witnesses knew about the notebooks, photos, or hidden cameras. Their testimony was based on David's public persona, not his actual behavior. David testified in his own defense against Graham's advice. He claimed his teaching methods were misunderstood. He said he documented students' personal information to provide better individualized support. He said the photos helped him remember each student's learning style. He claimed the hidden camera was for recording his teaching methods so he could improve his approach. Catherine's cross-examination was brutal. She asked why improving teaching methods required recording teenage girls from angles that captured their bodies. She asked why individualized support required documenting which students were emotionally vulnerable and most easily manipulated. She showed the jury David's notes about which girls wore revealing clothing and how he could position himself to see down their shirts. She read his communications with college students where he'd made explicit sexual comments. She asked why he'd fled from school to school after complaints instead of changing his behavior. David had no convincing answers. Closing arguments happened on a Friday afternoon. Graham argued that David had poor boundaries, but the prosecution hadn't proven criminal intent or that physical sexual abuse had occurred. Catherine's closing systematically destroyed that argument. She reminded the jury that grooming was itself criminal behavior designed to facilitate future sexual abuse. She walked them through David's pattern of identifying vulnerable victims, building inappropriate relationships, touching them without consent, and documenting everything for his sexual gratification. She showed them the hidden camera footage proving David had deliberately created situations to touch teenage girls inappropriately. She read David's own words describing his attraction to specific students and his plans to isolate them emotionally. She pointed to his history of complaints at multiple institutions and his pattern of fleeing before facing consequences. She asked the jury to use common sense. Did David's behavior look like passionate teaching or systematic predatory grooming? The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Sentencing happened in April. The judge allowed victim impact statements. 8 families spoke. Melissa's father described how his daughter had developed anxiety and trust issues after learning David had been documenting her body and planning ways to manipulate her. Isabel's mother talked about her daughter's depression and how David had exploited her loneliness. Caitlin spoke directly to the court saying David had made her feel violated and unsafe in what should have been an educational environment. College students described how David's behavior had affected their ability to trust professors and seek academic help. Each statement was gut-wrenching. When it was my turn, I told the judge that David had betrayed every principle of education and mentorship. He'd used his position of authority to access vulnerable students and had hidden his predatory behavior behind the mask of a caring teacher. I said the institutional failures that allowed David to continue for years meant the court needed to send a clear message that this behavior would be severely punished. I asked for the maximum sentence. The judge addressed David directly. She said his behavior represented a profound violation of trust and a systematic exploitation of vulnerable minors. She said his documentation and hidden cameras showed sophisticated predatory planning. She noted his history of complaints across multiple institutions and his complete lack of remorse or accountability. She sentenced David to 18 years in state prison for charges related to exploitation of minors, unlawful surveillance, and child endangerment. The state would also pursue civil action to ensure David could never work with students again and would be registered as a sex offender upon release. David showed no emotion as the sentence was read. The bailiffs led him out of the courtroom. Mom squeezed my hand. Outside, reporters asked if we felt justice had been served. I said the sentence meant David couldn't hurt anyone else for a long time. The real justice would be changing the systems that allowed him to move between institutions without consequences. Several families announced they were filing lawsuits against the schools and colleges that had ignored complaints about David. They wanted accountability for the administrators who'd protected a predator. The community response was intense. Parents organized to demand policy changes in the school district and at the community college. The superintendent who'd failed to investigate complaints about David resigned under pressure. The college president also resigned after internal review found that multiple faculty members had reported concerns about David's behavior with students, but administrators had taken no action. New policies were implemented requiring background checks that included contacting all previous employers, mandatory reporting of any boundary violations by staff, and immediate suspension pending investigation of any complaints involving inappropriate conduct with students. The college established an anonymous reporting system and hired a full-time Title IX coordinator. Parents pushed for state legislation requiring educational institutions to maintain public databases of employees terminated for misconduct so predators couldn't simply move to new schools. The legislative effort gained momentum after David's case highlighted how easily he'd moved between institutions. Life slowly stabilized over the following months. Mom sold our house because neither of us could stand living where David had operated. We moved into a smaller place across town. I finished my senior year and was accepted to several colleges. I chose one 4 hours away. Distance felt necessary. I needed space to process everything that had happened. The week before I left for college, Detective Moreno called. He said the investigation into David's previous institutions had led to 2 other arrests of teachers who'd been part of an informal network sharing information about vulnerable students. David had been communicating with them for years. The network was being dismantled. Moreno said my decision to investigate David's notebooks had protected countless students and exposed a larger pattern of predatory behavior in educational settings. I thanked him and hung up feeling exhausted. I'd done the right thing, but the weight of it never fully lifted. I started college carrying knowledge most 18-year-olds didn't have. The world was full of predators hiding behind respectable facades. Trust was complicated. Authority wasn't inherently safe. 10 years after finding David's notebook, I was working as an advocate for survivors of sexual exploitation. My job involved supporting victims through the legal process and pushing for policy changes in educational institutions. I thought about David often, how his case had started with one spiral notebook and expanded into institutional reform and multiple arrests. I spoke regularly at schools and colleges about recognizing grooming behavior and the importance of reporting concerns, even when you're not sure. I emphasized that predators rely on people dismissing red flags as misunderstandings or overreactions. Every ignored complaint gave them permission to continue. I told audiences that protecting children and students required vigilance from everyone. Teachers, parents, administrators, and students themselves all had responsibility to speak up when something felt wrong. During one presentation at a high school, A student asked if I ever regretted reporting David given how much pain it caused my family. I said my family's pain would have been worse if I'd stayed silent, and David had escalated to physical sexual abuse. Another student asked what advice I'd give someone who suspected a teacher might be inappropriate with students. I said trust your instincts and report concerns to multiple people if necessary. Better to be wrong and embarrassed than right and silent while students are harmed. David served 12 years before dying in prison from complications related to diabetes. The warden called to inform Mom and me. I felt relief more than anything else. David would never manipulate another student or hide behind the facade of caring educator. His victims could move forward, knowing he was truly gone. The institutional changes that followed his case had protected students in ways I couldn't measure. New reporting requirements had caught other predators before they could establish patterns like David's. The anonymous systems had given students safe ways to voice concerns. The policy reforms had created accountability for administrators who ignored complaints. One moment of courage, one decision to investigate when something felt wrong, had created ripples that extended far beyond what I could see. Students were safer because David was gone, and because the systems had changed. That mattered more than anything. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.